The sun hung merciless in the pale blue sky, casting long shadows across the endless stretch of red earth and scattered sagebrush. Sarah Mitchell pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to shield her from the desert's unforgiving heat. Her lips were cracked and dry, and each breath felt like swallowing sand. Behind her, she could hear the soft whimpering of her two children. Emma, barely 8 years old, stumbled along with her small hand clutched in Sarah's, while 10-year-old Jack tried to be brave, carrying their last water canteen even though it had been empty for 2 days. 3 weeks had passed since they'd fled their home in Kansas. 3 weeks since the bank had taken everything they owned. 3 weeks since Sarah's husband had died of fever, leaving her with nothing but 2 hungry children and the desperate hope that somewhere beyond the horizon lay a better life. But now, as she looked out across the vast emptiness that stretched before them, Sarah wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The wagon train they'd been traveling with had left them behind when their horse died, and the friendly travelers who had promised to help them reach California were nowhere to be seen. They were alone in a wilderness that seemed determined to claim them. "Mama," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "I'm so thirsty." Sarah's heart broke a little more. She knelt down and brushed the dust from her daughter's face, trying to smile even though her own strength was fading fast. "I know, sweetheart. We'll find water soon." But deep down, Sarah feared they wouldn't. They had been walking for days, without seeing another soul, and their food had run out yesterday. The desert seemed to stretch on forever, an ocean of sand and stone that swallowed hope as quickly as it swallowed footprints. Jack dropped to his knees beside them, his face pale, beneath the layer of dust that covered them all. "Mama, I can't walk anymore." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. If Jack couldn't continue, what would they do? She couldn't carry both children, and she couldn't leave either one behind. They were trapped in this endless wasteland with nowhere to go and no one to help them. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but even that seemed pointless now. God felt as distant as the mountains that shimmered like mirages on the horizon. They were going to die out here, and it would be her fault for dragging her children into this nightmare. The wind picked up, swirling dust around them and making Emma cough. Sarah gathered both children close, feeling their small bodies trembling against hers. They were so thin now, so fragile. How had she let things get this bad? Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her completely, Sarah heard something that made her heart skip. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. The sound of horses' hooves against stone. She lifted her head and squinted into the distance, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. There, emerging from the heat haze like something from a dream, she saw riders approaching, 3 of them, sitting tall in their saddles, moving with the easy confidence of men who belonged to this harsh land. "Children," she whispered, her voice shaking with hope and fear. "Someone's coming." Emma and Jack looked up with wide eyes, too exhausted to speak but alert enough to understand that their fate now hung in the hands of strangers. In the desert, that could mean salvation or something far worse. The riders drew closer, and Sarah could make out more details. The man in the lead sat astride a magnificent chestnut horse, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the sky. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow, but she could see the glint of spurs on his boots and the easy way he handled the reins. Behind him rode 2 other men, both armed and weathered by sun and wind. Sarah's mouth went dry with fear. Out here, far from civilization, there was no law except what men made for themselves, and desperate as she was, she knew that could mean anything. The lead rider pulled up about 20 feet away, his horse snorting and pawing the ground. For a long moment, he studied them in silence, taking in their ragged appearance and obvious desperation. Sarah could feel his gaze like a weight, and she instinctively pulled her children closer. Then he dismounted, moving with fluid grace, and Sarah got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sun-darkened skin and kind brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His features were strong but gentle, and when he removed his hat, dark hair fell across his forehead. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft and respectful. "Name's Thomas Garrett. These are my associates, Frank and Pete." He gestured to the other 2 riders who had also dismounted but kept their distance. "We're heading back to our ranch when we spotted you folks. Looks like you might be in some trouble." Sarah tried to speak but found her voice wouldn't come. The relief of seeing another human face, of hearing kind words instead of the endless silence of the desert, was almost overwhelming. Tears she'd been holding back for days began to flow freely. "Please," she finally managed to whisper, "my children ... they need water." Without hesitation, Thomas reached for a canteen hanging from his saddle. He approached slowly, as if he were dealing with frightened wild animals, and knelt down in front of Emma and Jack. "Here you go, little ones," he said gently, offering them the water. "Take small sips now. Don't drink too fast." Emma reached for the canteen with trembling hands, and Thomas helped her hold it steady. The sight of her daughter drinking clean, cool water made Sarah's knees weak with gratitude. Jack drank next, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face, as if he couldn't quite believe this stranger was real. "Thank you," Sarah breathed, accepting the canteen when Thomas offered it to her. The water tasted like life itself, washing away the dust and despair that had been choking her for days. Thomas studied her with those perceptive brown eyes, and Sarah could see questions there, though he was too polite to ask them directly. Instead, he looked out across the desert from where they'd come. "How long have you been walking, ma'am?" 4 days, Sarah admitted, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Maybe 5. I've lost track." One of the other men, Frank, whistled low. "Lord Almighty, how'd you end up out here on foot with young ones?" Sarah felt shame burn in her cheeks. How could she explain the series of disasters that had brought them to this point? The failed crops, her husband's death, the wagon train that had abandoned them when their luck ran out. It all seemed so foolish now, so impossibly naive. "We were heading west," she said quietly, looking for a new start. "But our horse died, and the people we were traveling with, they left us." She saw anger flash in Thomas's eyes, quickly controlled. "They left you with children?" Sarah nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't blame them. We were slowing them down, and they had their own families to think about." "Like hell, I don't blame them," Frank muttered, but Thomas silenced him with a look. "What's your name, ma'am?" Thomas asked gently. "Sarah Mitchell. These are my children, Emma and Jack." Thomas tipped his hat to each of them in turn, treating the children with the same respect he'd shown their mother. "Pleased to meet you all. Now, Mrs. Mitchell, we can't leave you out here. Our ranch is about a day's ride south. You and the children can rest there, get your strength back, and figure out your next move." Sarah's eyes widened. She had expected him to share some water, perhaps point them toward the nearest town, but this offer of genuine help was beyond anything she had dared hope for. We don't have any money to pay you," she stammered. "We lost everything when ... Thomas held up a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, out here, we don't leave people to die in the desert. Money's got nothing to do with it." Frank and Pete were already preparing to lift the children onto the horses. Emma, who had been so listless and weak just moments before, managed a tiny smile when Pete's horse nuzzled her cheek. "This here's Buttercup," Pete told her with a grin. "She's got a sweet tooth for sugar cubes, but she'll settle for a pat on the nose." Jack, despite his exhaustion, was fascinated by the horses and the men who rode them. Sarah could see him, studying their gear, their easy confidence, the way they moved as if the desert were just another room in their house. Thomas helped Sarah to her feet, his touch gentle but steady. "Can you ride, Mrs. Mitchell?" Sarah nodded, though it had been years since she'd been on a horse. "I think so." "You'll ride with me then. The children can ride with Frank and Pete. It's not far to a water stop, and we'll take it easy." As they prepared to leave, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not the desperate, grasping kind that had driven her into the desert, but something calmer and more sustainable. These men were offering her and her children a chance, and she was determined not to waste it. Thomas lifted Emma onto his horse first, settling her in front of his saddle where she could lean back against him. The little girl, who had barely spoken in days, whispered something that made him chuckle. "She wants to know if I'm a real cowboy," he explained to Sarah. "I told her I'm just a rancher who works with cattle. Same thing, I suppose, from a little girl's point of view." Pete lifted Jack onto his horse, and the boy's eyes went wide with excitement despite his exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, he looked like the child he was supposed to be instead of the too serious little man he'd been forced to become. Sarah found herself riding behind Thomas on his big chestnut gelding, her arms around his waist for balance. She felt awkward and self-conscious, acutely aware of how she must look and smell after days in the desert. But Thomas seemed completely comfortable with the arrangement, keeping up a steady stream of gentle conversation that helped distract her from her embarrassment. "The ranch belongs to my family," he explained as they rode. "My father started it about 20 years ago, and now my brother and I run it together. We raise cattle mostly, some horses. It's a good life, though it can be lonely sometimes." "Are you married, Mr. Garrett?" Sarah asked, then immediately wished she could take the question back. It wasn't any of her business, and it seemed improper. Somehow, if Thomas was bothered by the question, he didn't show it. No, ma'am. Haven't found the right woman yet, I suppose. My brother Marcus is married, though. His wife Alina will be excited to have other women around the ranch for a change. She gets tired of our rough company. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the horses' hooves creating a steady rhythm against the desert floor. Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks, lulled by the motion and by Thomas's solid presence in front of her. Her children were safe, they had water, and for the moment, that was enough. Thus the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They crested a small rise and Sarah saw something that took her breath away. Below them, nestled in a valley green with cottonwoods and fed by a clear running stream, lay the Garrett Ranch. It wasn't a grand place by any means, but after weeks of emptiness and desperation, it looked like paradise. The main house was built of adobe and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings scattered around the property included a barn, corrals, and what looked like a bunkhouse for ranch hands. Smoke rose from the chimney, and golden light spilled from the windows, promising warmth and safety and all the things Sarah had begun to think she'd never see again. "Welcome to the Circle G," Thomas said quietly. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes again, but these were different from the desperate tears she'd shed in the desert. These were tears of gratitude and wonder at the kindness of strangers. As they rode down into the valley, dogs began barking and people emerged from the house and barn. A woman with dark hair tied back in a practical bun hurried toward them, wiping her hands on her apron. This had to be Alina, Marcus's wife. Behind her came a man who was clearly Thomas's brother, though Marcus was taller and broader, with the same kind eyes but a more serious expression. Several ranch hands gathered around, their faces curious, but welcoming. "Thomas," Alina called out in accented English, her voice warm with concern as she saw the children. "What have you found?" Thomas dismounted and carefully lifted Emma down from the horse. The little girl swayed on her feet, but Alina was there immediately, gathering her into gentle arms. "Poor little one," she murmured, switching between English and Spanish as she examined Emma with experienced eyes. "You are safe now, Mia. We will take good care of you." Pete helped Jack down from his horse, and the boy stood uncertainly, overwhelmed by all the activity. Marcus approached him with a smile, offering his hand. "You look like you could use a good meal and a soft bed," he said. "Think you can handle some of Elena's cooking? I have to warn you, she makes the best biscuits in 3 counties, so you might not want to leave." Jack managed a small smile at that, the first one Sarah had seen from him in weeks. Thomas helped Sarah dismount, steadying her when her legs threatened to give way. The ground felt strange and unsteady after so long in the saddle, but his firm grip kept her upright. "Alina," Thomas said, "this is Mrs. Sarah Mitchell and her children, Emma and Jack. They've been walking in the desert for days." Alina's eyes flashed with indignation. Walking in the desert with children, she looked at Sarah with a mixture of outrage and compassion. "Come, you must eat and rest. Questions can wait." Sarah found herself swept into the warm chaos of the ranch house, Alina chattering in rapid Spanish and English as she bustled around preparing food and making arrangements. The house was simple but comfortable, with thick adobe walls that kept out the heat and furniture that was built for use rather than show. Within minutes, Sarah and her children were seated at a long wooden table while Alina placed bowls of hearty stew in front of them. The smell alone was enough to make Sarah's mouth water, and she had to force herself to eat slowly despite her hunger. Emma and Jack were less restrained, devouring their food with the desperate intensity of the truly starving. Alina watched them with tears in her eyes, periodically refilling their bowls and murmuring soft words of comfort. Thomas and Marcus sat across from them, not eating but simply watching to make sure their guests had everything they needed. The ranch hands had dispersed to their evening chores, but Sarah could hear their voices and laughter drifting in from outside, a normal, comforting sound that spoke of routine and stability. "How far were you planning to travel?" Marcus asked gently when the initial hunger had been satisfied. Sarah looked up from her bowl, suddenly aware of how she must appear to these kind people. Her dress was torn and stained, her hair was tangled and full of dust, and she probably smelled like she'd been walking in the desert for days, which of course she had. "California," she said quietly. "My husband heard there were opportunities there, jobs for willing workers, but he died of fever before we could leave Kansas, and then the bank." She trailed off, not wanting to burden these strangers with the full story of her disasters. "The bank took your land?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle but his eyes hard. Sarah nodded, too ashamed to meet his gaze. Samuel had borrowed against future crops, but the rains didn't come. When he died, they wanted payment immediately. I sold everything we owned, but it wasn't enough. Alina made a sound of disgust. Banks, they are like vultures, feeding on the misfortune of others, so you decided to head west. Marcus continued. It seemed like the only choice. I heard there was work in California, and I thought if we could just get there, we could start over. Sarah's voice broke slightly. I didn't realize how hard the journey would be, or how dangerous. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. Mrs. Mitchell, I don't want to alarm you, but you're still hundreds of miles from California. Even if you'd made it to the next town, which isn't likely, given the condition you were in, you'd still have the worst part of the desert ahead of you, plus mountains. It's not a journey to undertake lightly, especially with children. Sarah felt her heart sink. She'd known they were far from their destination, but hundreds of miles, it might as well have been thousands. How could she possibly manage such a journey with no money, no supplies, and 2 young children? What would you suggest? She asked quietly. Thomas and Marcus exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them. Alina, who had been listening intently while she served them, spoke up first. You will stay here, she said firmly, as long as you need. Alina, Marcus began, but his wife cut him off with a sharp look. No, Marcus, look at these children. Look at this poor woman. They have nowhere else to go, and we have room. It is decided. Thomas smiled at his sister-in-law's fierce protectiveness. Elena's right, Mrs. Mitchell. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to figure things out. We've got plenty of space, and frankly, Elena's been after us to hire some help around the house. Sarah stared at them in amazement. These people, who had known her for all of a few hours, were offering her a home. It seemed too good to be true, and she waited for the conditions, the expectations, the price they would demand in return. But Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. There's no obligation, Mrs. Mitchell, no strings attached. You can help Alina with the house if you want to feel useful, but mainly you just need to rest and recover and decide what you want to do next. I don't understand, Sarah said, tears beginning to flow again. Why would you do this for strangers? Alina sat down beside her and took her hands in both of hers. Because, me, Amor, we have all been lost at some point. We have all needed help. And if we do not help each other, what are we? That night, Sarah lay in a real bed for the first time in weeks, her children sleeping peacefully in the next room. The sheets were clean and soft, the mattress was comfortable, and through the open window she could hear the gentle sounds of the desert at night. Owls calling, wind in the cottonwoods, the distant lowing of cattle. But despite her exhaustion, sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept racing, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning she had been prepared to die in the desert, with her children. Tonight they were safe, fed and sheltered by people who had no reason to help them except basic human kindness. That it was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. What if she was dreaming? What if she woke up tomorrow back in the desert, dying of thirst? What if these people changed their minds in the morning light and decided she was too much trouble? A soft knock on her door interrupted her worried thoughts. Mrs. Mitchell, it was Thomas's voice. I saw your light was still on. Is everything all right? Sarah wrapped a borrowed robe around herself and opened the door. Thomas stood in the hallway, still dressed but looking as if he'd been preparing for bed. His dark hair was tousled and his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, making him look younger and less formal than he had during the day. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to keep anyone awake. I just... I can't seem to settle down. Thomas smiled understandingly. That's normal after what you've been through. Your body knows it's safe, but your mind is still catching up. Can I get you anything? Some warm milk, maybe? Or one of Elena's herbal teas? The kindness in his voice nearly undid her again. Mr. Garrett, I have to ask, why are you doing this? Really? People don't just take in strangers, especially strangers with children and no money. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. My father came west with nothing but the clothes on his back and a dream of a better life, he said finally. People helped him along the way, and he never forgot it. He always said that kindness was the only thing that made sense in a hard world. But surely there are limits to kindness, Sarah pressed. You don't even know us. We could be criminals, or con artists, or ... Are you? Thomas asked with a slight smile. No, of course not. But how could you know that? Mrs. Mitchell, I've been dealing with people all my life, both honest and otherwise. You're not a criminal or a con artist. You're a mother trying to protect her children, and you've been through hell doing it. That's all I need to know. Sarah felt fresh tears threatening. I don't know how to repay this kindness. You don't have to repay it. That's what makes it kindness instead of a business transaction. Thomas paused, then added gently, Look, Sarah, may I call you Sarah? You don't have to decide anything tonight, or tomorrow, or next week. Just focus on getting your strength back and letting your children be children again. Everything else will work itself out in time. After he left, Sarah finally managed to fall asleep, and for the first time in months, she didn't have nightmares about banks and failed crops and dying alone in the desert. The next few days passed in a blur of rest and gradual recovery. Alina fussed over all three of them, feeding them enormous meals and generally treating them like beloved family members who had been away too long. Emma, who had been so quiet and withdrawn during their ordeal, began to bloom under the attention. She followed Alina around the house, learning to cook and helping with simple chores, chattering happily in a mixture of English and the Spanish words Alina taught her. Jack was drawn to the ranch operations like iron to a magnet. Marcus and Thomas took turns showing him how things worked, letting him help with small tasks and teaching him to ride one of the gentler horses. Sarah watched her son transform from a worried, overburdened child back into a normal 10-year-old boy, and it was better than any medicine she could have taken. As for Sarah herself, she found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. Alina had been right about needing help with the house. Cooking for ranch hands was a major undertaking, and there was always washing, mending, and cleaning to be done, but it was good, honest work, and Sarah threw herself into it with gratitude. More than that, she found herself genuinely enjoying the company of her rescuers. Alina was warm and funny, with a sharp tongue for anyone who didn't meet her standards, but endless patience for those she loved. Marcus was quieter than his brother, but equally kind, with a dry sense of humor that emerged once you got to know him. And Thomas, Sarah tried not to think too much about Thomas, but it was difficult. He was unlike any man she had ever known. Her late husband Samuel had been a good man, but he'd been driven by big dreams and grand plans that never quite worked out. Thomas seemed content with the life he'd built, confident in his abilities without being arrogant, kind without being weak. He treated her with unfailing respect and courtesy. But Sarah sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. It made her feel fluttery and uncertain in a way she hadn't experienced since she was a very young woman. One evening, about 2 weeks after their arrival, Sarah was sitting on the porch mending one of Jack's shirts when Thomas joined her. The children were inside with Alina and Marcus, playing some card game that involved a lot of laughing and good-natured arguments. Nice evening, Thomas commented, settling into the chair beside her. Sarah nodded, looking out over the valley as the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. It's beautiful here, so peaceful. It wasn't always peaceful, Thomas said. When my father first claimed this land, he had to fight off claim jumpers, bandits, and hostile Apache, but he was determined to build something lasting here. He sounds like a remarkable man. He died 5 years ago, but I still find myself asking what he would do when I face difficult decisions. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Sarah's needle moving steadily through the fabric while Thomas whittled a small piece of wood. The evening sounds of the ranch settled around them, horses nickering in the corrals, the soft lowing of cattle, ranch hands talking and laughing around their own evening fire. Sarah, Thomas said eventually, and something in his tone made her look up from her mending. I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you given any more thought to what you want to do? I don't mean to rush you, he added quickly. You're welcome to stay as long as you like. I'm just curious about your plans. Sarah set down her sewing and looked out at the sunset. It was a fair question, and one she'd been avoiding thinking about too seriously. The truth was, she'd been happier in these past 2 weeks than she'd been in years. The work was satisfying, the company was wonderful, and her children were thriving. The idea of leaving all this behind to continue their dangerous journey to California held no appeal whatsoever, but what were the alternatives? She couldn't impose on the Garrett family's hospitality forever, no matter how generous they were, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was developing feelings for Thomas that were both inappropriate and dangerous. She was a widow with 2 children and no prospects, hardly the kind of woman a successful rancher would seriously consider. I don't know, she admitted finally. California seems like a foolish dream now. I had this idea that we could start fresh there, that somehow everything would be different, but I think I was just running away from our problems rather than actually solving them. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Running away isn't always bad. Sometimes it's the only choice you have. But you're right that geography doesn't solve everything. The thing is, Sarah continued, surprising herself with her honesty. I've been happier here in 2 weeks than I was in the last 2 years in Kansas. This feels like ... like home, like the kind of life I want for my children. Then why not stay? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Stay, Thomas. I'm a penniless widow with no family and no prospects. I can't just decide to stay somewhere because I like it. Why not? Thomas asked again, his tone serious now. Sarah, you're not penniless. Elena's right that we need help with the house, and you've already proven you're worth your weight in gold. We could make it official, hire you as our housekeeper. The job comes with room and board for you and the children, plus a salary. It would be enough to give you independence and security. Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding. You'd do that? Offer me a real job? In a heartbeat. Elena's been after me to make the offer since your second day here. She says she's never had such competent help, and she's gotten attached to Emma and Jack. It was a generous offer, more generous than Sarah had any right to expect. But something about it made her heart sink rather than soar. A job was better than charity, certainly, but it wasn't what she'd been secretly hoping for, though she'd hardly dared admit that hope even to herself. That's very kind, she said carefully. I'd need to think about it, discuss it with the children. Thomas seemed to sense her hesitation. Sarah, is there something else? Some other concern? Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. How could she explain that what she really wanted wasn't a job, but a life? Not just security for her children, but love and companionship for herself. How could she tell him that she'd begun to dream of a future where she belonged here, not as an employee but as family? It's nothing, she said quickly. It's hard to believe that everything could work out so well after so much bad luck. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when Sarah finally gathered the courage to look at him, she found him studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Sarah, he said softly, what if I told you there was another option? Another option? Thomas set down his whittling and turned to face her fully. What if I told you that these past 2 weeks have been the happiest I've ever been? That watching you with your children, seeing you laugh with Elena, having you here in our home. What if I told you it's made me realize what's been missing from my life? Sarah's heart began to race. Thomas, ... I know it's presumptuous, he continued, his words coming faster now, as if he was afraid he'd lose his nerve. I know we haven't known each other long, and you've been through so much. But Sarah, I think I'm falling in love with you. Asterisk, the words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. This kind, wonderful man was telling her he loved her. It was more than she had ever dared dream. I love you too, she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I've been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was just gratitude. But, Thomas, I think I fell in love with you the moment you offered Emma water in the desert. Thomas reached for her hands, his touch warm and steady. Then marry me, Sarah, not because you need security or because you're grateful, but because you want the life we could build together. Marry me and make this your real home. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were tears of pure joy. Yes, she said, laughing through her sobs. Yes, of course, yes. Thomas pulled her into his arms then, and his kiss was everything Sarah had dreamed it might be, gentle but passionate, full of promise and hope for the future. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. The children, Sarah said suddenly. What will Emma and Jack think? I should ask them. I already asked Jack, Thomas admitted sheepishly, yesterday, when we were checking the fence line. I wanted to make sure he'd be okay with me as a stepfather before I said anything to you. And he said, and I quote, it's about time. Mama's been smiling funny whenever you're around, and Emma keeps asking when you're going to be our new papa. Sarah burst out laughing. They've been watching us, haven't they? The whole ranch has been watching us, Thomas said with a grin. Elena's been dropping hints for a week, and even the ranch hands have been making bets on when I'd finally work up the courage to propose. As if summoned by their laughter, the front door burst open and Emma came running out, followed by Jack, Elena, and Marcus. Emma launched herself at Sarah with a squeal of delight. Mama, are you going to marry Thomas? Are we going to live here forever and ever? Sarah looked around at these people who had saved her life in more ways than one, and she felt her heart overflow with gratitude and love. Yes, sweetheart, we're going to live here forever and ever. Elena was crying and laughing, at the same time, hugging everyone she could reach. Marcus was grinning and shaking his brother's hand. Jack was trying to look grown-up and serious, but his excitement was showing through. As the celebration continued around them, Thomas pulled Sarah aside for a moment. Are you sure? He asked softly. Really sure? Because once you marry me, you're stuck with this crazy family, this hard life, this wild country. Sarah looked out over the valley that had become her home, at the man who had become her love, at her children who were finally free to be children again. The desert had taken so much from her husband, her security, her innocence about the hardness of the world. But it had also brought her here, to this moment, to this choice that felt like no choice at all because it was so clearly right. I'm sure, she said, rising on her toes to kiss him again. Thomas, 3 weeks ago I thought hope was lost. I thought we were going to die alone in the desert, but you found us, you saved us. And now I can't imagine wanting to be anywhere else. 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning with wildflowers blooming across the desert and the cottonwoods green with new leaves, Sarah Mitchell became Sarah Garrett. Alina had sewn her a beautiful dress from fabric ordered specially from Santa Fe, and Emma served as her flower girl while Jack stood proudly beside Thomas as his best man. The ceremony was held in the ranch's courtyard, with all the neighboring ranchers and their families in attendance. It was a simple affair, but it was perfect, full of laughter and love and the promise of the life they would build together. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Sarah marveled at the turns her life had taken. A year ago, she had been struggling on a failing farm in Kansas. 6 months ago, she had been dying in the desert. Today, she was surrounded by love and laughter, married to a man who adored her and her children, part of a community that had embraced them completely. Any regrets? Thomas asked as he spun her around. Sarah looked up at her husband, and smiled with her whole heart. Only that we waited so long to find each other. Well, Thomas said with a grin, I guess we'll just have to make up for lost time. And as the music played and their friends and families celebrated around them, Sarah knew that they would do exactly that. The desert had tested her, broken her, and nearly destroyed her, but it had also delivered her to exactly where she belonged, and she would be grateful for that gift for the rest of her life. The sun set over the Circle G Ranch that night in shades of gold and pink and orange, painting the desert in colors of hope and promise. And in the adobe house by the stream, the Garrett family, all 5 of them now settled in for their first night together, safe and loved and home at